Memoir, Memory, and Mastery, a brief review of Reading Lolita in Tehran. This is an overview in connection to cultural diversity in the 21st century. My name is Matt Hess. I'm a graduate student at Post University. Reading Lolita in Tehran is a memoir of Azar Nafisi, who is an Iranian-American author and university professor. The experiences in this memoir are a reflection of her accounts in Iran, and they occur from 1979 at the onset of the Iranian Revolution through 1997. The book is broken into 4 parts, each relating to a work of literature that she was teaching either in the university or in a private book club that made up of mostly female students, and she taught in her home. The 4 parts are listed here, and they were Lolita was the first part, and it relates to living in a totalitarian society where governments had demanded obedience. And it was a good reflection as she portrayed it. She introduced the concept in the beginning as she had 2 photos of her class, one in traditional garb that had covered, and another where the students were allowed to dress as they liked. And there was a stark contrast where one photo, none of their personalities were visible, and in the second photo, each of them had unique characteristics that were visible. And it was a good introduction to the contrast of the effects on the individual living in a totalitarian society and how it affects each person, not just society as a whole. In the second part, Gatsby, the class had read The Great Gatsby, and this had taken most of its setting in the classroom in the university, where they actually put Gatsby the book on trial, and Nafisi had represented the book as the defendant, and her male classmate, who was very involved in the beliefs of the revolution, was the plaintiff. And there was a stark contrast in what was actually on trial. As The Great Gatsby talks about adultery, and that in society in Iran at the time was punishable by public stoning. The book itself actually reflects the dangers of dreams, where the Iranian government had come into power trying to relive the dreams of the past and make a totalitarian society and oppressing the rights of women. And the same thing was themed in Gatsby, where it talks about the American dream. And that was one of the counterpoints, which made for a lot of good discussion when you talk about a multicultural classroom and teaching multicultural values. And that's something we'll talk about in a subsequent slide shortly. The third part was James, and it occurs during the Iran-Iraq War in this timeline of the memoir. And it talks about the increased opposition of women, where they're forced to wear coverings in public and can't make eye contact with males or have contact with males. And in this section, Nafisi uses Daisy Miller in Washington Square to discuss the significance of war and sacrifice and the importance of freedom. It actually has context in World War I, and it talks about, or she relates to how much one is willing to sacrifice in order to have the freedom. It's kind of a precursor to her making the decision to leave Iran and immigrate to America in part 4. And part 4 is called Austin, and it relates to the literature of Pride and Prejudice. And it really divulges into how totalitarianism impacts all aspects of an individual's life. And there's really a connection with this mentor of Nafisi and the interaction they have in the coffee shop, where he chooses to go with cultural acceptance when asked if he was with Nafisi, which would be contradictory to the considered quote-unquote norm. He chose to go with the norm versus acknowledging that they were together. So you could see there was some emotional impact for Nafisi, and I also think it was helping her facilitate the decision to ultimately leave her family and life behind in Iran and immigrate to America. So how can we relate the literature to 21st century diversity issues that were covered in EDU 604? I'd like to start this conversation by a quote from Reading Lolita in Tehran that says, I'm a perfectly equipped failure," and that was said by Nafisi. And the importance of this quote is, if Nafisi was, let's say, an American, and we would gauge her success, she is a married woman with a successful career who puts others' needs, that being her students, above herself. And in the culture of Tehran at the time of the memoir, she's actually considered an outlier of society because she's advocating for things that are anti-government and anti-flow for the movement of the regime. So you have these two stark contrasts of what we would define as success, where we would praise her action in, let's say, America, where she would otherwise be jailed or publicly humiliated in Iran. So how we relate this to the classroom. So I'm going to read this quote that I have here on the slide. "Deep cultural analysis requires analyzing the actual interactions among actual people in shared community contexts that contribute to children's achievement over time. And in addition to that, when multicultural education is viewed as therapy for prejudice and stereotyping, which is a common view, teachers and counselors take on the role of a therapist, helping students to examine their prejudice and attitudes, identify negative feelings about themselves and others, and identify misconceptions that they use to judge people and replace negative with positive images." So really here in the classroom, it's important for us as educators to consider the context to which our students take on information. Like, there are cultural biases and filters to which information is absorbed, and that information, typically speaking, is biased in its making, as most authors are white with as far as a race goes, and they could be from a northern, typically European background or perspective, and that does create a barrier for our minority students who have a different historical context. So it's important for us to have a good cross-section of content creators that are from multiple cultures to provide multiple perspectives on any given event in history. And then our role as educators is really to facilitate the appropriate behavior for dealing with this diversity. So there's not always one right way to look at a particular event, and having those multiple perspectives and accepting those perspectives may be different and based on different beliefs are important, especially the younger our students are, as it's building this foundation for them to build on. So us as educators must be role models, model the way for acceptance, and not make a negative connotation to cultures that may be different than our personal cultures in our upbringing. So one way we can incorporate this into the classroom is using culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching refers to the teaching methods and practices that incorporate cultural identities and lived experiences of all students in the classroom. And it's important that in this model, it is a student-centered approach where the students are really working together in multiple ways of absorbing information and practicing information amongst peers. And there are 5 components to culturally responsive teaching, which are listed here, and I've tied that back to the example of Nafisi, which I believe she does in Reading Lolita in Tehran in her practice as a college professor. So the first component is having a strong knowledge base, which Nafisi does. She's a well-respected literary professor, and her students respect her so much that they were willing to protest her expulsion and be jailed because they respect her approach to teaching so much. The second component is culturally relevant curriculum, and it is shown in the Reading Lolita in Tehran as Nafisi brings in Western literature in her classroom. Even when it's illegal, she does the Western literature in her private book club, so she has this multicultural approach. She has high expectations for all of her students. Even when the oppression of women was present, she had the same expectations for males and females. And appreciation for difficult communication styles. She really does encourage the students, especially in the example of the Great Gatsby trial, The students who agreed with her perspective that were silent, she kind of encourages them to speak up, and saying that that was kind of the point of the literary exercise. Um, and again, that kind of ties into the multicultural instruction, where she's teaching the perspective of Gatsby, and the real meaning is not about adultery, but necessarily it's about the impact of the American dream and how it actually is similar to the Iranian Revolution dream, where you can't live in the past. In our pasts, when it is sailed and you're living in the past, it actually brings about the negative impacts of those who are trying to implement that dream, whether that be Gatsby, who ultimately dies in the end of the novel, or the Iranian Revolution, which does not stay in power. So what are the societal impacts of the themes in Reading Lolita and Tehran? There's really three: women and gender, literature, the impacts of literature and religion. In the context of women and gender, you really there's a stark contrast in the regime oppressing women. And I have this quote here that really says, it was really about the women oppression. It doesn't necessarily have to do with their race or creed. It says, in our case, the law really was blind. It's a mistreatment of women. It had no religion, race, or creed. So, racism is not really the play here. It was just an overall encompassing oppression of just women in general. And you could even see that in our current society here, as there's a huge conversation about women's rights, and with the reversal of Roe versus Wade this year by the Supreme Court. So women as a whole, their rights are currently being debated and attacked in our culture. You kind of relate that to the societal impacts of the context of this literature. And the importance of literature is that it allows for our society problems to be viewed through a different context and explore those social misjustices, and that was seen in the Great Gatsby trial, which we've already discussed. And lastly, religion. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Religion has been used for the justification for war and oppression many times throughout history, and it is interesting that same religious values are also used by the oppressed to provide hope that there is a higher power, and they find comfort in these times of oppression. So, really applicable to our society now, and values that are lessons we can use if we incorporate these concerns into our curriculum and classroom teachings. So in summary, I think some of the lessons learned is that culturally responsive teaching is very important and effective, and I think Nafisi did a good job modeling this in her approach to teaching literature in an oppressed society, especially in her book club with her select group of students, and that literature, even fiction, can provide such a unique perspective within the classroom that it can be used to talk about topics that are either considered taboo or illegal or of a minority opinion. And my suggestions moving forward is that we increase access to content creators from minority or disadvantaged populations, and increase funding to allow for student-centered classroom and culturally responsive teaching practices within all of our school systems, and a study that would analyze the benefits of culturally responsive training for current and new educators, and also doing how much of a cost for both large school systems and smaller school systems. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope you took away an important message or two.